Alrighty, welcome to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today we're talking about the Progressives and the Muckrakers. Essentially how these groups expose the corruption of the early 20th century America. These are the guys and gals that are going to go ahead and really dig down deep and dig through the muck to get to the truth and expose it. And that's what we're talking about today. So first, what really does kind of almost become a turning point is the Triangle Shirtwaist fire. Now, this is a very famous fire that unfortunately happened in New York. In fact, it was the most dangerous workplace accident until 9/11. And what happened here is unfortunately pretty simple. Within a half hour, what happened was somebody, we don't know who, threw a cigarette or a lit match or something, who knows, into a bunch of scrap garment. Now, a shirtwaist is a very was basically what a woman would wear, a very fashionable woman clothing at the time. And so, you know, we have lots of women working in this factory. It was towards the end of the day. This scrap bin had caught fire. What had happened is that the fire hoses did not work. The ladder to go ahead and help save them, as this happened, very high up. It was actually not long enough that the New York Fire Department had, so it wasn't long enough, so they couldn't save them that way. On top of that, the fire escapes weren't checked, so they collapsed. And because there's such narrow entrances and exits, so the women would get their purses checked to make sure they weren't stealing any fabric or anything like that. It led to trampling. And overall, it was a tragedy. It was an absolute tragedy. This is going to put in a lot of codes, workplace codes, building codes that, for example, in public buildings, doors now swing outwards because to prevent trampling. This is something that is because of the Triangle Shirtwaist fire. But again, that's a perfect example of what progressives and muckrakers do. They fight for reform, or essentially change, for the better. So who are these progressives? A progressive is someone who, again, believes in political change and reform through governmental action. They want to improve life, or they want to improve something about it, about something going on that's not right in society, and they're going to go change it. So progressives, for the most part, were an optimistic group. They were urban, mainly in the cities. They were middle class. They were the voice of the lower class. But again, a lot of times the lower class, they weren't educated, so they wouldn't be able to really amass all this reform for sure. They were committed to democracy. A lot of times they were seen as socialists and socialist movements, but they really were committed to democracy, committed to the U.S. And it also helped women gain positive change in society. Yes, women were progressives. They're going to go ahead and put through reforms that are going to help earn women the right to vote, which we're talking about today. They're also going to believe in the application of solutions to these societal problems. There are issues in society, especially back then, and they have solutions to those problems. And they're not afraid to go ahead and tell the government to step in and make sure those solutions get put into place. So that's what a progressive is. Now, a progressive is a little bit different from a muckraker. Now, a muckraker and progressive can be one and the same in some cases. Could be the same person. They could be both. But muckrakers were more journalists. They were the ones that were raking through the muck to get to the truth. They were the ones exposing the corruption, some cases in business, some cases in politics, again, hoping to bring reform. So muckrakers were the ones digging deep, getting that info so the progressives could go ahead and apply it. So newspapers and magazines that are going to come out for muckrakers are going to be huge, including McClure's magazine, probably one of the most famous, because of course Ida Tarbell did write in that McClure's magazine, and of course Ida Tarbell herself. Now, Ida Tarbell is someone who is inspirational. She's going to go ahead and take down Standard Oil. Now, if you remember, we talked about Rockefeller and his very corrupt practices with the oil industry. Well, she's going to go ahead and take down that monopoly. That's right. It's pretty impressive. Now, here's a quote from her. Rockefeller and his associates did not build the Standard Oil Company in the boardrooms of Wall Street banks. They fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage and price cutting, by ruthless efficiency of organization. Oof. Based on this quote, what industry do you think she was attacking? Yeah, the oil industry. Standard Oil. Again, what happens here is insane. Ida Tarbell does have an absolute reason to go ahead and get Rockefeller, bring him to justice. And that's because Standard Oil achieved its monopoly through aggressive and very often illegal means, including what happened to her father. Because Ida Tarbell's father had committed suicide after Standard Oil drove him out of business. That is something that sticks with her, and that's a big push of why she does go ahead and attack Rockefeller. So, in the end, what are some of these business practices that they were doing that was so illegal? They were purchasing competitors by making them sell, undercutting prices, doing some shady deals with the railroads, and they went as so far as to destroy a competing oil refinery in Buffalo, New York. Again, Ida Tarbell really let people know what was going on. She wrote articles to raise the public awareness of the monopoly and how bad it was, how horrible it was. Her efforts led to the eventual breakup of Standard Oil. Now, what's amazing is when you look at these political cartoons of Standard Oil, you're like, oh my goodness, that is not what Rockefeller looked like. But really, it's to show just how big Standard Oil had become in 1906, how it had its arms wrapped around the government, looking towards the White House, mind you. Look at that, and the bottom left corner, and of course had arms wrapped around Congress and other governmental buildings as well, and congressmen with legislature. And Standard Oil was doing whatever they wanted. They were bigger than the country. Look at this, huh? So of course it had to be dealt with. Lincoln Steffens, he's another one that's going to go ahead and be against, be a muckraker, and in this case, progressive as well. He's a son of a very wealthy businessman, but in 1902 to 1911, he was an editor on McClure's magazine, and he's going to be more focused on city corruption, like grafts, which grafts are basically bribes. Again, another word for bribes. He's going to become a radical communist later in life, which unfortunately kind of loses some steam because of that. But what he's going to attack is people like Boss Tweed. Now, Boss Tweed, or William Marcy Tweed, is going to be the mayor of New York, and he's going to rig elections. He's going to go ahead and have kickbacks to jobs. Again, meaning that he'd go ahead and give contracting job to someone to go build, some sort of building in the city, but as long as he got a kickback, again, he got some money, he would just go ahead and choose them, even if they weren't the most qualified. Again, vote early and vote often. That's like a saying, because of course you can only vote once. He had ballots where there were fake names on the ballots to get him elected. This is the type of corruption Lincoln Steffens goes after and exposes, which is fantastic. Another huge progressive is Gifford Pinchot. Giffy goes ahead, he's part of the Progressive Party, which is a political party at this time as well, and he advocates to keep the forest preserved. As you can imagine, we're going to be talking about one of the most progressive presidents we've ever had, Teddy Roosevelt, and Giffy is going to be on his administration. Because Teddy Roosevelt, just like Giffy, does want to go ahead and help preserve this beautiful country the way, nature intended it to be. Again, with protecting national parks, and of course, really preserving the forest. A lot of their work that they did here in the early 1900s is going to go ahead and still be seen today. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have some of these amazing parks that we have. So, another big thing we see here is that workers have horrible conditions. We kind of talked about it a little bit before, but essentially, no OSHA, injuries were very common in the workplace. In fact, child labor was used more so in England than here. However, because child labor was common, there are going to be a lot of, you know, outcry to go ahead and pass laws where you can't go ahead and have children in the factories. In fact, these laws are going to make children, yes, go to school and get an education, which is better than going to a factory. I swear. These factory conditions were horrible. And you can see in the table here, which is perfect, is the percentage of children between 10 and 15 who worked. And in 1890, that's 18.1%, but see how much it has dropped by 1920. That's huge. That really is. One big movement we have here is women's suffrage. Now, women's suffrage is really women earning the right to vote, and they earned it, as we're going to see here. Men and women both worked hard to convince not only the government, but people as well, that the laws on voting requirements should be changed. And there has been a huge, ever since 1848 in Seneca Falls, a huge women's rights movement, but it was slowing down. They weren't getting the results they wanted. And so, very unsatisfied with the slow progress, we have Lucy Burns, Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party in 1916, and they are going to be more radical than ever, including fasting and chaining themselves to the White House railings, basically picketing for the right to vote. And eventually, they win. The 19th Amendment is passed, added the Constitution that women were allowed to vote in August of 1920. Now, what's interesting is that women were allowed to vote prior to this, but it was a state issue. It wasn't a federal issue at all. In fact, which may surprise you, is that men and women both campaigned more so in the western part of the country for equal women's suffrage. Again, really it was because Wyoming had adopted the first state constitution to allow women to vote. In fact, women could vote first in Wyoming as a territory, but then when they applied for statehood, literally the government was like, well, that's fine and all, we'll let you become a state, but you're just going to get rid of like that whole women voting thing. And they said no, and they didn't. They stuck to their sides there. They said we're going to keep that in the Constitution, and they have the first state constitution where women were allowed to vote. Much of the West follows soon thereafter, and so it's very surprising in that a lot of times we think some of the more northern states are the progressive states, right? Massachusetts, New York, etc. But if you look, these are states that didn't really have women's suffrage, didn't have women couldn't vote in these states until much later on. Really, it's the West that we see this huge explosion that women are allowed to vote, and this is what helps carry it into, of course, the 19th Amendment and making it a federal law. So, altogether, let's review some examples of progressive activity. We have improving education by getting, child labor out and getting students into the classroom. We have regulating large monopolies, where these huge monopolies like Standard Oil are going to be regulated and broken down if they are hurting the consumers. Again, child labor laws, again, to help children, not be subjected to work and be the breadwinner in the house when they should be going and educating, getting an education to better themselves. Preserving national parks and conservationism as a whole, helping improve the conditions of the cities, which we saw a little bit in the last when we talked about Jacob Riis, stopping any type of corruption in politics, just like William Marcy Tweed, and of course, women's suffrage. So we've actually had a lot of examples of progressives already in this short amount of time here, in this last less than 15 minutes. It's incredible. And these progressives are going to flow right into our next topic, which is Teddy Roosevelt, one of the most progressive presidents we have ever had. All right. Thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you back in the classroom.